I'm here with Gary Taubes, who, among other things, is the author of a book called Why We Get Fat. And you might think he's going to talk about carbohydrates and portion control and all the other wonderful things that people who have diabetes have been told they have to do to lose weight, along with exercise. But there's actually something quite radical about your theories and your explanations. And I think we started out a minute ago by, when we walked into this room, I said, what if you could prove that the world actually was flat? And that may make no sense, but it will after you talk. So explain a little bit about the process of your research and what's led you to the conclusions that you're now thinking about.
Okay, well, I was a science journalist, not a doctor, not a nutritionist. I was a hardcore science journalist and something of an investigative reporter in science. So I specialized in controversial science, good science, bad science. Physicists have a phrase they call pathological science, which is the science of things that aren't so. That's when people discover non-existent phenomena, when they in fact screw up and discover the wrong thing. So I was working in physics and nuclear engineering and writing about these controversies. In the early 1990s, one of my friends in the physics community said, if you're fascinated with bad science, pathological science, you should look at this stuff in public health. It's terrible. And so I moved into public health, writing mostly for the journal Science. And by the end of the decade, I was doing year-long research projects on some of the fundamental tenets of our nutritional beliefs. You know, does salt cause hypertension? Does a low-fat diet a healthy diet? And I kept running up against the reality that nutrition research was really quite flawed and quite incapable of making some of the claims that we had come to take as dogma. And then in the early 2000s, I was asked by the New York Times Magazine to do a story on obesity. The obesity epidemic was new. Yeah. And you could localize it in time from the late 70s to somewhere between the late 70s and the early 90s. And the idea was what made Americans fatter, what caused the obesity epidemic.
Well, we all know that I think 1 out of 3 Americans today is considered obese. And I believe the statistic you reported is it was 1 out of 5.
It was 1 out of 8.
1 out of 8 in 1960. So yeah. We are definitely getting fatter on a statistical basis. And the traditional explanation has been that we eat too much and we don't exercise enough. Right. So in your work, you call that the energy hypothesis.
The energy balance hypothesis. So yeah, the idea is we take in more calories than we expend. We take in more energy than we expend. That gets stored in our fat tissue. We get fatter. It seems like it's decreed by the laws of physics. Yeah. You know, that there's some kind of physical truth to it. Yeah. And because that's the way to lose weight is to eat less and exercise more. Yeah. You know, and the obesity epidemic that we've seen is caused just by this kind of, as we become more prosperous as a nation. Yeah. Food becomes available everywhere. There's convenience stores in every corner. There's fast food. There's these huge portions that you see in these restaurant chains. You could easily buy 1,200 calories worth of lunch at McDonald's for $10. And obviously this is a cause of obesity. And plus we've become more and more sedentary because of televisions and video games. You know, I have children. Getting them away from the iPad and out into the world is a Herculean endeavor. But one of the things I found in my research, which I talked about today at the conference, was you could go back to the literature and you could find populations with high levels of obesity, as high as we had today in some cases, with none of this toxic environment, no fast food joints, no convenience stores, no vending machines, in many cases are on borderline starvation. These are people with the populations where you see undernutrition, stunting in the children, malnutrition, deficiency diseases, and yet high levels of obesity. The first one I found in the literature was the Native American tribe, the Pima, in 1902. There's a Sioux on the South Dakota Crow Creek in 1928. By the 1960s, these populations are being documented in Africa and the South Pacific and the Caribbean and South America, in the United States. Exceedingly poor populations. None of this toxic environment. Hard-working people. oil field laborers, agricultural laborers, construction line workers. So they're physically active. They're barely getting enough food to survive, and yet they're obese. It goes against everything we think we know about this problem. And the question is, something was making them obese. Being obese is not a natural state. We don't see obesity in animals in the wild. Even when they're prosperous, when there's plenty of food around, you don't get obese animals, you just get more animals. So what was driving the obesity in those populations, and why would that be any categorically different from what's driving it in our population? That's the question I set out to answer.
So there's another explanation, which is a hormonal one, and that the fact that we don't talk about hormonal imbalance today, and we're going to get to insulin in a bit, is largely due to the Second World War. And
well, it's even interesting. That's part of it. There was another part. Hormones was always perceived as an excuse for an obese person to not do what a lean person does, to not eat in moderation, to not push the plate aside before they're full, to not go out and walk 10 miles a day. So as early as the 1920s, back when endocrine organs were still known as ductless organs. Okay, insulin is discovered in 1921. Growth hormone, I think, was discovered a few years later. Physicians had no idea what hormones really are. They're completely new to this concept, and yet they're dismissing a hormonal explanation of obesity as an excuse for a fat person not to do what lean people do. So even when it was clear that there were these insulins that were driving fat accumulation, it was always obvious that insulin drove fat accumulation, the hormone insulin. As soon as Banting and Best and their colleagues in Toronto discovered the hormone and synthesized it and gave it to young diabetics, they immediately, their bodies just filled up. They put on fat. There's a quote from, it was Banting or Best saying, the first time I ever gave insulin to a diabetic dog, I knew it was a fat-promoting hormone. But hormones were an excuse. They were perceived as an excuse. Fat people just had to be more. There was this kind of puritanical attitude. They had to eat less. They had to exercise more, even in the 1920s. And then while U.S. physicians were talking about this, German and Austrian researchers were studying the problem. And as I mentioned in the talk, all meaningful medical research was done, all meaningful science was done in Europe pre-World War II. You think of science as a European invention. And it was honed to perfection by Germans and Austrians, in the first half of the 20th century. And if you wanted to do meaningful research, if you were an American doctor and you wanted to do research, you learned to speak German, you learned to read German, you went to Germany or Austria, you worked with these, worked as an apprentice to these hair professor doctors. And these people ran clinics, they saw patients, they did animal experiments, they had the whole experience of what it is to see the disorder in humans, which is crucial. Because nowadays, if you're studying the molecular biology of the disorder or the genetics of the disorder, you're never dealing with a fat person. You're never dealing with an obese patient. You're not taking a history. You're not hearing about when they got fat or why they got fat or where they're getting fat or the circumstances. You're dealing with populations and statistics and rats and mice. So these researchers, these pre-World War II Europeans, came to think of obesity as a hormone. It had to be a hormonal regulatory defect. Because there are all these signs that tell us men get fat above the waist and women get fat below the waist. That tells you that sex hormones are involved in the accumulation of fat and fat cells. They had a case, one of the cases that they considered telling was a young girl back in the late 19th century had a bad burn on the back of her hand. So her doctors took skin from her stomach and grafted it to the back of her hand. And then she grew up to become obese. And she had this big fat tuft of skin on the back of one hand but not on the other. So they said, this is fascinating. Whatever it is that accumulates, that makes tissue accumulate fat, it obviously moves with the tissue. So there are factors in the tissue, in the fat cells themselves, that will determine whether a cell will, and they called this lipophilia. Lipophilia means love of fat. And the idea was some tissue, some cells are very lipophilic, and others aren't. So we don't get fat on our forehead. So obviously whatever this skin is not lipophilic, but we do get fat in our guts, and that skin is. And they just assume once we understand what regulates this lipophilia, this affinity for accumulating fat, obviously some people are more lipophilic than others. It's biological, it's genetic, it's endocrinological, it's enzymatic. Once we work all that out, we'll know what causes obesity. And then this whole school just vanished with the Second World War.
Yeah, so all the hormonal evidence, the hormonal school of thought, if you will, sort of disappears after the Second World War. The winners write history, the losers
Well, this
go
is,
home.
I mean, and one of the things I documented in my book, so there's a great German textbook on metabolic diseases written by a fellow named Eric Graf that the leading American nutritionists are studying in Germany, and they're meeting with these people, and they convinced Graf he should have it translated. So the English translation comes out in 1933, and virtually all of the references are German language references because it was a German textbook. The first monograph ever written on obesity itself was in the United States was in 1940 by a Northwestern University endocrinologist named Hugo Roney. And of the 600 citations in the book, roughly a third, about 220 or 30, from the German language literature, German journals, Austrian journals. The next clinical guide to obesity is written in 1948 by two Mayo Clinic physicians. That guide now has 600 references also, of which 12 or 13 are from the German language literature. And after that, it just vanishes, and the whole theory with it. And meanwhile, this one American physician and researcher, Louis Newberg of the University of Michigan, who's convinced that obesity is a willpower issue, it's a gluttony and sloth issue. He refers to obese patients as fatties. You know,
lazy fatties.
Yeah, lazy fatties, and it's his work and his pronouncements. He's one of the few American researchers who continues writing about obesity through the war years. And I actually found seminars and conferences in the 1950s where they published the proceedings and the Q&As, and you could see people saying, well, Newberg said this and Newberg said that, and therefore that's true. And again, medicine has this kind of tendency to believe that if an authoritative figure said it, it must be true. In physics, we were taught the opposite, question everything. But you don't get that as much.
So in treating diabetes, you know, it's well known that insulin promotes weight gain. And in fact, that's one of the great ironies. You're told as a diabetic you need to lose weight, and those people who were given insulin said, but how? And yet, somehow the connection hasn't been made between the oversecretion of insulin and weight gain, particularly in type 2 diabetes, where we know it's insulin resistance is the problem. The pancreas keeps pumping and pumping and pumping out insulin, and finally some of it gets where it has to go, but increasingly less of it. But guess what? People gain weight. So it's either a pretty simple cause and effect, and yet it doesn't seem to have made its way into the literature or the practice of science.
Well, there's a lot of things that happen that work to this. And it's funny, it is in the literature. If you go to the textbooks, Williams' textbook of endocrinology, or Leninger's biochemistry textbook, these are seminal texts, and just go to the index and look up adipocyte, which is a fat cell. Okay, and then you go to look at adipocyte and you look at what puts fat in a fat cell, and it'll tell you insulin does. Insulin upregulates lipoprotein lipase, which is an enzyme that sits on the outside of fat cells and pulls fat into the cells, and it suppresses hormone-sensitive lipase, and it facilitates the entrance of the glucose into the cell, where the glucose can be converted to fat, or the glycerol molecule can be used to bind fatty acids into triglycerides. There's all, insulin is what it'll tell you. But then when you go to the section on obesity, and both of these books will have a small section on obesity, then it'll say you get fat because you're taking more calories than you expend. This belief in energy balance and that calories in, calories out is so profound. And I saw this throughout my research, that even the researchers who studied fat metabolism didn't think to themselves, the same thing that makes a fat cell fat is what makes a human fat, because a fat human is just a compendium, integration of all his overstuffed, too numerous fat cells. By the way, it's insulin that makes fat cells proliferate, that takes, you know, pre-differentiated fat cells and turns them into fully formed fat cells. So what do we secrete insulin in response to? It's a carbohydrate content of the diet. When you're pumping insulin in to keep your blood sugar under control, it's because you've had a carbohydrate-rich diet. And what I realized in the book is, so the European school vanishes. with the war, and then obesity research is kind of recreated de novo at the Harvard School of Public Health by guys who study, you know, rats and mice and nutritionists. They're not clinicians, and on top of it, the Harvard School of Public Health is getting funded by General Mills and you know, companies that make breakfast cereals. And the biophysicists, biochemists, and endocrinologists, physiologists developed these tools so that they could actually figure out what regulates fat accumulation. So by the early 1960s, it's clear it's insulin. So insulin, you know, and Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Bersin did pioneering work in this, and Bersin died in 1970, Yalow won the Nobel Prize in 77. They said, look, if you want to get, insulin's a fundamental regulator of fat metabolism. If you want to get fat out of a fat cell, you have to lower insulin. That's what you got to do. You just got to get your insulin down. Okay? So how you do that is you remove the carbohydrates from the diet and you replace them with fat, because fat's the one nutrient that doesn't stimulate insulin. But the problem is, in the 1960s, we were beginning to believe that dietary fat caused heart disease. Saturated fat in particular. So saturated fats in animal products. If you want to eat a very low-carb diet, the way you do it is you eat animal products, because with the exception of milk, there's not a lot of carbs. You know, we are not made of carbohydrates. We're made of fat and protein. There's very little carbs in the form of glycogen in our muscles. So there was this movement in the heart disease, nutrition, cardiology world to get people on low-fat diets, even before the studies were done, to confirm that this idea that fat caused heart disease is correct. And by the 1970, the American Heart Association was telling every American over the age of 2, including lactating and pregnant women, that they should be on a low-fat diet. By 1977, the U.S. Congress got involved. By 1980, the USDA's got involved. Study after study after study failed to confirm that a low-fat diet's a healthy diet.
It's certainly interesting that I assume you can read all of this in Why We Get Fat.
You can, yes.
You know, I've read a brief summary of the observations in Scientific American, and it is a really fascinating tale, and only the beginning of one. But the idea that carbs are bad, and that you know, high fat is bad, has also been contradicted, and you know, the Atkins diet being you know, probably the primary example of it. And I believe, if I remember correctly, that Atkins was sort of condemned as a malpractice. When he first proposed that, you know, eat all you want as long as you eliminate the carbs, and you know what, it worked, at least for a time in many people. So
this is what happened. So Atkins comes along, like many physicians in the 1960s. He himself started getting heavy. So he's reading the same literature I read 40 years ago, and he goes, look, insulin regulates fat accumulation. So if you want to get your insulin levels down, now you could fast, but there were studies published in JAMA and elsewhere showing that what happens when you fast is basically the equivalent of what happens when you remove carbohydrates. Because when you fast, you start eating your own body, which is protein and fat. So you could just remove the carbs and eat protein and fat, and you have the same effect. So people like Atkins said, look, I'll just take the carbs out, and I'll eat a high-fat, moderate protein diet, and they lost weight effortlessly, and then they put patients on it. And often the patients would say, Doc, what are you doing? You've lost weight. So it's natural to put your patients on it. The science linking saturated fat to heart disease was very new and very speculative. So then they wrote books about it. And as soon as they wrote books about it, the book sold like hotcakes, pardon the expression. Atkins' book, I think, was the fastest selling book in history. And the medical research community was rightfully scared about these diets, because they thought they put you in the state called ketosis if you go extreme, very low carb, high fat. And now we're dealing with, and they knew about ketoacidosis that uncontrolled diabetics often die of, but that's a much, much more severe condition. So there was a lot of hesitancy that these were healthy diets. And then he was pushing a high-fat, high-saturated fat diet and rubbing it in. So this idea you could eat lobster Newburg and quarter-pound, double cheeseburgers without the bun. And he was certainly sticking it in their faces. And so they responded with articles implying that he was a quack, that this was dangerous, that there was no science behind it. And as I documented in my books, by the 1970s, throughout the 1970s, there's this process by which the medical research community, you have to understand, obesity is a new field of research in the US. So the NIH only starts funding obesity research in 1973. And the whole field is dominated by 6 guys, half a dozen men. Okay, they're at Columbia, Harvard, Yale, Rockefeller,
Yep.
Penn.
Yep.
They write the textbooks, they host the conferences, they determine the research priorities,
Yep.
and they don't like Bob Atkins, who they knew personally.
Right.
They don't like the idea that a medical doctor unaffiliated with an academic institution, let alone the kind of prestigious academic institutions they worked at, was saying he knew what had solved obesity and they didn't. And they wanted to get rid of Atkins, so it's literally a baby in a bathwater, well, figuratively, a baby in a bathwater issue. The bathwater was Atkins. The baby was the hormonal enzymatic regulation of fat accumulation. If you pay attention to what puts fat in the fat cell, you end up on a low carbohydrate diet. But then Atkins was right. So in order to get rid of the baby, the bathwater, they got rid of the baby also. And by 1980, any discussion of the hormonal enzymatic regulation of fat accumulation has been divorced from a disorder of excess fat accumulation. I mean, imagine somebody walked in the room here and he was 8 feet tall, and we weren't allowed to talk about growth hormone. Because some doctor we thought was a quack had blamed excess growth on growth hormone.
One of the things that really struck me in the Scientific American article was the fact you laid out that, you know, you would think that with all the advice we're given about the way to lose weight, the causes of obesity, as currently conceived, that there must be some really good studies, you know, not observational studies, but controlled scientific experiments like you have to do to get a drug approved. Behind all this, and surprisingly, to me at least, there aren't any. So you're going to try to solve that problem, and I'd like you to tell us how.
Well, so that's what we, with a colleague, Dr. Peter Attia, we co-founded a not-for-profit called the Nutrition Science Initiative. It's in San Diego, California. This was originally going to be a nights and weekends type endeavor, but then we were contacted by a foundation in Texas, the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, and after doing much due diligence on these ideas and on us, the Arnold Foundation decided to back us, to give us seed money to get us going, and so we could start performing our mission. Our mission is, ultimate mission is to reverse the burden of obesity and chronic disease that we see in diabetes as we see in society today. But we would like to, the way we're going to do it is by facilitating and funding very well-controlled, rigorous research studies that'll test these hypotheses. So the idea is you have competing hypotheses of obesity, for instance. On one hand, it's just calories in, calories out. It's an energy balance issue. On the other hand, it's this hormonal regulatory defect that's driven by the macronutrient content of the diet. So the carbohydrates in particular drive you to store calories as fat. And these are competing hypotheses. And they can be tested, and we could set up experiments to test them. And what we've done is we've recruited some of the best researchers, best scientists in the obesity field, nutrition, skeptical researchers, to design the experiments, to carry them out. And our job is basically to make it easy for them to do it and to get them enough money so they don't have to cut corners. Because everyone knows, you know, one of the fundamental problems with research today is there's not enough money to go around. So everybody's cutting corners and then making assumptions that those corners that they cut didn't affect, you know, the results.
These things take time too. It's important to have longitudinal data, a year, 18 months?
Well, there's different ways to do it. So there's different questions we're asking. If we're just asking the question, what is it that regulates the accumulation of fat and fat tissue? Is it just this energy balance thing, or is it the macronutrient content? That kind of study can be done very tightly controlled in a metabolic ward. It's very expensive. That's why these studies haven't been done in the past, or haven't been done well and long enough in the past. But you could get pretty conclusive answers after 2 to 3 months. Okay, then you have longer term studies looking at You know, if let's say these studies actually confirm what I personally believe, which is the carbohydrate content of the diet that's driving obesity. So the implication is you should be on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, but it could be that that diet is harmful. That's what we believe as a nation. That's what the public health authorities are telling us. So for that case, now 3 months isn't long enough. And after 1 year, you could put people on these diets. The longer the study goes, the less control you have over. Now, instead of having people living in a hospital ward where you're feeding them, now you have free-living people who may or may not be doing what you tell them. Now, we're already funding 2 studies that are free-living, but we've been encouraging the research, and they've been encouraging themselves to maximize their contact with their subjects, and they're using innovative technologies, smartphones, to make sure that their subject, to just keep hammering home, this is a diet you're eating, this is a diet you're eating. And after a year, you could look at heart disease and diabetes risk factors. Now, these studies have already been done. This is what got me into this research. And in every case, the low carbohydrate, high fat diet does better. You can put someone on an American Heart Association low fat, low calorie diet where you're eating skinless chicken breast with a little, ice cream scoop size of rice and some vegetables, no butter, no oils, or you could be eating a low carb, high fat diet, the iconic scrambled eggs with bacon, and on that saturated fat rich diet, they end up after a year having better heart disease risk factors and better diabetes risk factors. But you can't really trust risk factors. So, I mean, they're a good sign that the people on the low-carb, high-fat diet are healthier, but they're not, it's not ironclad evidence. Ironclad evidence, now you've got to go 5 or 10 years and look at what are called high endpoints. Do these people really do they have more or less heart disease? Do they have more or less cancer? Do they have more or less strokes? And those studies eventually will have to be done too. But the longer the study takes, and the more people you have in it, the more expensive it gets. And so there's a lot of fundraising that has to be done to get these studies done and get them done right.
Well, it not only gets expensive, but the longer the study goes on, the more causes can intrude. It's
funny, there's 2 problems. So one is, and this has dogged the studies that were done in the past. So let's say you're going to take 10,000 Americans and 5,000 are going to eat a low-fat diet, lots of whole grains, fruits and vegetables, lean meats, and the other's going to eat a very low-carb diets, lots of animal products, lots of dairy and cheeses and eggs, and so you give them guidance, you give them counseling, you give them books, you give them smartphones, you do everything you can, you give them diets every week, you prod them, what did you eat today, you try to keep them on the diet. So the people on the one diet might start falling off that diet. They're eating, they like carbs. Let's be serious, everyone likes carbohydrates. So maybe they're supposed to eat 50 grams a day, but after 6 months they're eating 200 grams. That's what the research shows. The other diet, the one on the low-fat diet, they're also falling off their diet. And look, you cut carbs, you lose weight. That's what the studies show. So they actually start maybe eating less carbs. So the diets tend to converge together, so that by the end of a year or 2, everyone's eating the same diet. It's healthier than it was before they started the study. So these are the kinds of struggles. One of the reasons we founded the Nutrition Science Initiative is to deal with these kind of challenges, because we don't believe they've been successfully. The evidence shows that the nutrition studies to date have not successfully figured out how to keep these people eating different diets for long enough to find out. What you want to know is, if I eat like this, am I going to be healthy or not? And not if somebody gives me this book, am I going to be healthy or not? But if I actually follow the advice in the book and do it for the rest of my life, will I be healthy or not? And those kind of studies, they have to be done. And they have to be done better than they've been done in the past. And, we're dedicated to raising the money to get them done.
One of the last questions to me is, if the hormonal hypothesis were shown to be valid, or at least to exist side by side with the energy hypothesis, and perhaps that's not possible, but let's say it is for the moment. does that in effect give some people a free pass? In other words, say, well, you know, this is all hormonal, nothing I can do about it, so, you know, give me a second helping. And the problem actually gets worse while they're waiting for the pill to be developed.
You know, that's always been one of the fears, okay? As soon as you say, and this again is why 90 years ago people were dismissing the hormonal hypothesis.
Yeah.
Because it becomes, I need a free pass. And you could look at the flip side, which is the hormonal hypothesis. I mean, there's a lot of hormones that regulate fat accumulation.
Right.
I said, you know, we know female sex hormones. When men get older and they secrete less testosterone, testosterone suppresses fat accumulation in our guts. So you secrete less testosterone, you put on fat here. But insulin is the connection to lifestyle.
Yeah.
That's what links it to lifestyle. So now you've got a disorder. This is where it's worse is if you know that carbohydrates are key, but your problem might not be such that your problem might be that it might be so metabolically disturbed that even a very carbohydrate restricted diet doesn't significantly reduce your weight.
Yeah.
So again, I'm arguing that it's the carbohydrate content of the diet that causes obesity to begin with, the refined grains, sugars, starches to some extent. But once you've had these foods in populations, and you've been consuming yourself, there are some changes that happen that are irreversible, epigenetic and changes, you know, when we're in the womb, if our mothers are eating these foods, when they're pregnant with us. So some people are just doomed to be fat to some extent anyway. But now they're living in an environment where people think we do know the cure, and other people have cured themselves. So even if they're on very carbohydrate restricted diets, people are going to assume that they're not doing what's necessary. So there's going to be social repercussions, even if this is right, that could be, I don't know if you've ever lived in New York or spent time in New York.
I have, yeah.
You know, New York, where there's smoking bans now in all office space, so you walk around and you see, you know, people down on the streets, and they look like pariahs now. I mean, really, they must feel so guilty when they do it. I mean, I used to be a smoker, but luckily I quit before that era. And I could see similar things happening to people who remain fat, even if they cannot, even if on a very carbohydrate restricted diet, they can't get lean. Maybe they can lose a little weight, and then the implication will be they're not. Now we know what the answer is, and you're not doing it.
Now, the name of the book is Why We Get Fat. The author is Gary Taubes, and it's been great talking to you.
Well,
There's so many, we could talk for another hour,
Easily.
but and I hope we get a chance to as your research continues and as we explore what you're uncovering.
Thank you very much.
Great seeing you.